Okay, so this is an idea I had way back when, during a time when the Disney/Sony Spider-Man deal faltered for like 2 seconds. I thought of this kinda intricate Spider-Man universe, not even close to my DCU project as I've stated, but I still thought it was pretty good. I'm just gonna do it all in one video, similar to the American Doctor Who video, because it's a lot simpler and I don't care as much about this version as I do for my DCU project. I'm not going to do casting or anything like that. I'm just going to show their picture on the screen with the actor's name for the first appearance and then just show their picture for the rest of the video. I also probably would change a couple things now, but I decided to ultimately keep it intact, so here we go. Our first film is The Spectacular Spider-Man. Since the animated series is universally beloved, as well as changing up what we got before, I decided to use spectacular for the adjective in this case. So in this film, we have a Peter who is out of college, just lost Gwen, and has yet to find a job. We start with a very broken Peter. He is still trying to process his grief and is dealing with the consequences for his actions, as well as Harry trying to process his grief for his father who died from the goblin situation after Peter failed to save Gwen. Maybe his goblin solution went toxic or something. Maybe Peter killed him and that's why he's so emotionless. So you have Peter being very closed off from people and emotionless because he has a duty to the city, while Harry is being very emotional and Peter isn't there for him because if Peter killed him, he can't face his friend. So that is our major subplot. We also have a subplot with Mary Jane who enters Peter's life somehow. Maybe Peter gets a temporary job as an assistant on a photo shoot and meets her or something. I don't know. So there is our minor romantic subplot. Meanwhile, our big plot is Spider-Man meeting our big villain for the film, Kraven the Hunter. It's pretty much going to be Kraven pushing Peter to his limits when Peter is still grieving. So you have Peter wrestling with both of his lives while trying to stop Kraven. In the end, he does defeat him, finds a balance in his life by moving on from Gwen, with asking MJ out on a date, as she would have wanted Peter to be happy. But the major consequence of the film is that due to Peter not being a good friend to Harry and trying to get through their losses together, their friendship is permanently broken. Next is The Spectacular Spider-Man 2. Peter's life is a bit better. He's starting to date Mary Jane. He got the job at the Daily Bugle that he goes to an interview for in the last film, but he and Harry are no longer speaking, and he's not getting great money at the Bugle. Here we have the reemergence of the Green Goblin. Now, it's obviously Harry because it was set up in the last film. Since it's painfully obvious to the audience, it would be revealed to us very early on that he is the new Green Goblin. But the characters in the film don't know that, so the entire film is dramatic irony of the characters trying to figure out who it is and what his endgame is. Until the third act, that is. For Harry, it would be a Jekyll and Hyde situation, but Harry would be a bit more aware. Like he's embracing the goblin side and likes that feeling, like a drug almost. He's just so fueled by anger, it clouds his judgment. He's still, for the most part, a good person deep down, but the anger is getting the best of him. We kind of have Peter wrestling with his life as both Peter and Spider-Man like always, and him trying to sustain this life with MJ. We also have him kind of dealing with the ghost of Norman Osborn a bit. He kind of feels guilty that he couldn't save him, looking back on the things that he could have done differently, or if he did kill him, feels guilt because of that. And then when it's revealed to Harry, it hits him like a bag of bricks. In the end, Harry is killed by his own glider, like in the original Raimi film. But he and Peter reconcile before he ultimately succumbs to his death. Next is The Spectacular Spider-Man 3. This one takes place a couple years later. Peter and MJ are very happy together despite Peter still struggling with his double life. Since it takes place so long afterwards, he's not really dealing with Harry's death prominently. He still comes up from time to time, but not as much as Gwen did in the first film. Here, the villain is Mr. Negative, and his plot, I ultimately decided to make it like the game, because that's all I really know about Mr. Negative. Obviously, things would be tweaked, so it wouldn't be just a copy and paste job. I think I would like to make the inner demons more of a brainwashed cult who are promised immortality and invulnerability, but are really there to fuel Mr. Negative's power. Maybe Aunt May, being very old, gets entranced by the cult, so there's more of a personal vendetta with Peter versus Mr. Negative. I don't have as much of an in-depth plot for this one, only because I wanted to use another villain that wasn't showcased on screen yet, but the unfortunate part is, it's a villain I don't really know very well outside of the game. Next, we have the Sinister Six. Haha, you thought I was going to say Spectacular Spider-Man 4, but I fooled you. So this would have taken the idea that Sony had for a while and finally use it because I thought it was a pretty good idea. You can make this a soft reboot. Maybe, maybe not. I'm still going to be using the same picture for Peter because I don't really have anyone else in mind for the role, but if you do, use your imagination here. But this film would be told from Doc Ock's point of view, who has been in prison the whole time. He has been formulating a plan against Spider-Man, and he is using his most famous enemies against him. Peter won't be showcased as the villain or anything like that, just the antagonist. Doc Ock is clearly the villain, and he will be showcased as such. The villains in this film are Doc Ock, Electro, Sandman, Vulture, Mysterio, and Scorpion. They would break out at the end of the first act. Most of the second act is fighting the villains one-on-one or one-on-two. The third act finale would have the entire Sinister Six fighting Spider-Man and him somehow besting them. Not sure what that would be, but he would because he's Spider-Man. Moving on. Next, we have the Spectacular Spider-Man 4. This is the start of kind of a new trilogy. As I said, it could have a new actor in the role of Spider-Man. I'm not really going to do that personally, but more than likely it probably would. So this movie would jump ahead a year. Tombstone would be the villain. He would pretty much be Kingpin, but since Sony doesn't exclusively own the rights to Kingpin, I used Tombstone, which is good because Tombstone deserves more love. He's a pretty damn good villain. So this movie would involve Tombstone finally doing something about Spider-Man because he thinks he's a nuisance to New York and he's trying to stop his evil plans. So this would kind of be like Daredevil Born Again, where Tombstone finds out Peter's identity and tries to ruin his life. I don't know if there's a Spider-Man equivalent to that, but I really want Spider-Man's life to really break down again to that vulnerability. Mainly because we haven't seen that in a while, and when Spider-Man defeated the entire Sinister Six by himself, it was a bit much. So this one would break him down entirely. We would see smaller villains employed by Tombstone. Those would be Chameleon, the Tinkerer, and Hydro Man. Chameleon would obviously be the biggest because he can take over Spider-Man's life as he's the Chameleon. The Tinkerer can possibly fuck up his web shooters or something like that. And Hydro Man is kind of just dumb muscle. The Chameleon would have the most prominent role though. In the end, Peter's life is almost entirely destroyed. But he still manages to defeat Tombstone in a similar way to the game, where he reverse engineers the thing that made Tombstone like the way he is, and he cures him, while also taking him to prison and exposing his dirty work. Black Cat would be reintroduced here to help Spider-Man expose Tombstone. They had a short fling right after Gwen died, but Hardy found out who Spider-Man really was, and the mystique was gone. Bit of a retcon, but it could still work. Also in this movie, MJ thinks that Peter is cheating on her, due to him spending a lot of time with Black Cat to try and defeat Tombstone. She doesn't know specifically what he's doing, obviously, but that he's off somewhere with another woman. Felicia Hardy shows up at his apartment since she knows who Peter is, and MJ is on the brink of breaking everything off, while Peter wants to propose to her. So that's our minor romantic subplot. At the end of the film, he reveals that he's Spider-Man to MJ, realizing what she thinks is happening, and to help mend that trust. And he also proposes, and she says yes. Next up is our first real spin-off with Black Cat. I initially didn't have much of a setup for the spin-off, it was just the first spin-off I had in mind. But I thought I'd properly set it up with the previous film in this case. So this one is kinda simple, it's just Felicia Hardy's life from her father's imprisonment, how she becomes Black Cat, her original villainous tendencies, her fling with Spider-Man, and how she treads the line between hero and villain. Ryan would be a minor character, and Black Cat's rape is only subtly implied rather than outright shown. I thought it would be a bit too dark, so it'll only be implied. But yeah, simple film about Black Cat. Next up is the Spectacular Spider-Man 5. It starts off with Spider-Man in the first act fighting Rhino and Shocker. It's revealed at the end of the first act that Spencer Smythe is the main villain. He has been obsessed with Spider-Man constantly due to J. Jonah Jameson's reporting that Spider-Man is a menace. So Smythe wants to recreate the Sinister Six to defeat Spider-Man. So using some of his tech, he brainwashes Rhino and Shocker to doing his bidding, but Spider-Man defeats them anyway. Smythe is enraged, but he realizes he must do this himself. So this is where he builds the Spider Slayers. At the midpoint, they are revealed, and they and Spider-Man battle. He is easily defeated. Tinkerer is brought back so that he can get a few years off of his sentence to help Spider-Man defeat the Spider Slayers. They eventually fight one more time, and thanks to both Peter and Tinkerer's smarts, they are then defeated, and Spencer Smythe gets away scot-free because he's a tech mogul type who can easily get bailed out. And there isn't a lot linking him to the Spider Slayers. Next is Spider-Man 2099. This would pretty much be, similar to Black Cat, an origin story for Spider-Man 2099, since he's not that well known. Tyler Stone and Goblin would be the main villains, and this would very much be a Blade Runner-esque movie, hence the people I chose to helm the film. So yeah, that would pretty much be it. Next is Spectacular Spider-Man 6. Here we have a bit of a mix-up. Initially, I had the project after this movie be before this movie, but considering this didn't make sense, you'll know when I reveal the next project, I decided to make this movie come before the next project, so this movie would be the final movie involving Peter Parker as Spider-Man. Here, he fights Hobgoblin, and it's pretty much more of a run-of-the-mill movie, but with a bit more of an epic feel. We'll have a lot of stuff involving MJ and Peter, and with Peter doing this for so long, he kind of wants to retire and settle down with MJ. But he has a duty to the city, so we have all of that. Then there is Hobgoblin, who is less of a discount Green Goblin in this movie, and more so uses his smarts, since the only contribution Ned Leeds has in the Marvel Universe was being blamed for the crimes of Hobgoblin. I'd like to have this sort of be a twisted game for Hobgoblin, kind of in a Riddler way, where Spider-Man has to find out who the real Hobgoblin is before he enacts his ultimate plan, whatever that is. Maybe it's turning the entire city into hobgoblins, I don't know. But whatever it is, Spidey finds out who the real one is, and he defeats him. In maybe a post-credit scene, we tease the next project, which is the Clone Saga. Yes, I'm bringing in one of the worst and most controversial Spider-Man stories into this universe. This is sort of going to be a bare-bones version of it, pretty much what it originally was going to be until Marvel screwed it up. And the reason I called it a project is because it's going to be a video game. Again, I like the idea of really extending the universe, you know? So kind of similar to the Insomniac game, it's going to be split into two parts. The first part is going to be based on the original Clone story back in the 70s with Gwen, the two Spider-Man, and Miles Warren. Then the second part would involve the reappearance of the other Peter after the Gwen who escaped died, and them teaming up against Kane Parker. It also involves some story beats from the comic, like Aunt May dying. It eventually leads with Peter settling down and Ben Reilly taking up the mantle of Spider-Man. So I initially had this before the sixth movie, with Ben Reilly being showcased in that movie, but I feel that didn't make sense because the original 6 movies should be about the ups and downs of Peter Parker. And then Clone Saga happens, and then Ben Reilly taking the reins for the rest of the universe's existence. Next up is Spider-Woman. The Jessica Drew version specifically. This would be an origin story in regards to Spider-Woman, how she gets her powers, how her parents get killed, how she's adopted by a terrorist organization to commit atrocities, and that kind of thing. The main villain would be Count Otto Vermis, with the secondary villain being Contingency, who is pretty much Taskmaster in everything but name. Since Sony doesn't own Taskmaster, I had to come up with something on the fly. A young Miles Warren and an old Miles Warren would be supporting characters. It would pretty much be Spider-Woman learning to become a true hero after learning of what the organization's true intentions are. The organization could be anything that Sony owns, since the comics it's Hydra and they can't use Hydra, so it can be made up or whatever, doesn't matter. Next we have Silk. Another origin story. The first half of the movie involves Cindy Moon being trained by Ezekiel Sims and getting imprisoned so she is safe from Morlun. Then it's through flashbacks while in her cell do we get her backstory. Then the midpoint, we see Spider-Man learn of this and he thinks Sims is evil and breaks out Moon. She's kinda on the fence because she knows the threat of Morlun, vaguely, but she also doesn't want to be imprisoned, obviously. Plus, she thinks she will be kept safe by Spider-Man. Together they fight Black Tarantula. Morlun is cameoed in a post-credit scene. Next is the Spectacular Spider-Verse, The Other. This would be an animated movie, and all the spider beings of the universe are called to stop Morlun by Ezekiel Sims. So, the original Peter Parker Spider-Man, Ben Reilly Scarlet Spider, Silk, Spider-Man 29, and Spider-Woman, as well as Sims, team up to stop Morlun. Peter sacrifices his life to save the universe, and Miles Morales gets bitten by a radioactive spider in a post-credit scene. Now we have Spider-Girl. Now we move ahead to many years in the future where we follow Peter's kid, May Parker, who never knew her father due to his death in the previous film. So we deal with a major consequence from that film, and this is that direct consequence. In this film, we have May discovering her powers and that her dad was Spider-Man from Ben Reilly, who is still alive. The reason that Ben doesn't become a part of her life until now is because Mary Jane thought it would have been too weird and confusing to have Ben, who isn't Peter, around and was cloned from a time where he had no idea who MJ is. Mary Jane prefers to have May believe Peter is dead because, well, he is. Ben isn't Peter, and so she doesn't want to raise her child under the false idea her father is still alive. So yeah, May would be pissed, but it wouldn't be some huge misunderstanding. She would get it. So he trains her until he's killed at the midpoint by the main villain, revealed to be the Sinister Seven. This would be teased in the first half, but not outright shown. So now she has to stop the Sinister Seven, which consist of Kraven, Second Mysterio, Sandman, the Second Hobgoblin, Slide, Molten Man, and Doc Ock. Also, various supporting characters from May's life would be showcased as well. Next is the Ultimate Spider-Man. So now we continue the story from the present with Miles becoming Spider-Man, but in a way we haven't seen before. So we have more of a struggle of Miles realizing his powers and if he should become a hero. It would be a little darker and he has no guiding light because at the same time, Spider-Man finds the symbiote and is starting to become evil Spider-Man. But this is all through the eyes of Miles, so he has no guidance and has to step up to truly be the hero to save people from the symbiotic Spider-Man. It would pretty much be Into the Spider-Verse, but with no other spider people, and a lot darker. Miles manages to defeat Peter and get the symbiote off of him. In a post-credit scene, it attaches itself to Eddie Brock, who has kind of been a secondary antagonist throughout the movies, but not outwardly showcased as much. Then we have The Spider-Man Part 1. So this would serve as a direct sequel to Ultimate Spider-Man, with Ben and Miles, going by the name Arachnid, teaming up to fight Venom. He would be defeated by the midpoint, and then Carnage would become the villain, with Cletus Cassidy being teased in the first half. We also have Ben subtly preparing Miles to be his true successor, and Miles dealing with being a hero and kind of being in Spider-Man's shadow, and almost being showcased as a sidekick. While it might be a bit much to have Venom and Carnage in the same movie and both being the villain, I thought it would be a bit derivative to have two movies about Spider-Man defeating symbiotes, so I stuck them in the same movie. I mean, it can't be any worse than Venom Let There Be Carnage, so whatever. Next up is The Spider-Man Part 2. This would involve Miguel enlisting the help of Ben and Miles to come with him to 2099 to stop the rise of Deimos, Morlun's brother. It would also be revealed in this film that 2099 is a separate universe and not the future, since There is a bit more breathing room if the idea of 2099 is false. The human race got technologically advanced faster, hence why the world looks like that in that universe's 2099. Not a big deal about where 2099 takes place, but whatever. So the 3 Spider-Man would defeat Deimos, and Ben and Miles would head back to their universe. Next is The Ultimate Spider-Man 2. So this would take place 18 months after the previous film, and Ben finally leaves Miles to his own devices to retire, as he doesn't want to die like Peter, even though we all know that isn't the case. And Miles becomes Spider-Man. Eventually, the Lizard breaks out of prison, and Miles has to prove that he is the Spider-Man New York needs. The reason I wanted to use the Lizard is because he hasn't been shown in this universe yet, and he is an important villain in his rogue gallery, as well as the fact that Miles doesn't know the specifics about Kurt Connor's condition, and how it's more so a Jekyll and Hyde situation, and Connors doesn't want to be a monster. But Miles doesn't know this, and he can't ask Ben for help for whatever reason, or he thinks he doesn't need his help and wants to prove himself. So, Kurt wants help from Peter, who he doesn't know is dead, but he keeps getting beaten up by this kid who doesn't know what's going on with him. So Lizard keeps getting angrier and angrier until he just can't stop, and it's almost too late for Miles to realize he isn't a total villain. So with this, Miles eventually helps him and cures him properly, something in this universe Peter couldn't do. So Miles ultimately proves, not necessarily to New York, but to himself, that he can be Spider-Man. Then Ultimate Spider-Man 3. This would take place 6 months later, and it would have Miles being comfortable as Spider-Man. So we have to fuck that up because we can't have Spider-Man be happy and shit. So with that, we have the Prowler as the main villain. It would question everything Miles has done up until this point, throwing up doubt that if he can be Spider-Man while having a villain for an uncle. There will be a smaller subplot with Miles and a love interest who is Francine Fry, who turns out to be the second Electro. Her backstory won't be as complicated as it is in the comics, but it'll sort of be an interesting subplot with Miles trying to find some sort of solace in his life, but that turns to shit too. So at the end of the day, he fights Prowler and he gets arrested, learning that he shouldn't have doubts in himself because of who his uncle is. Plus, Aaron reassures him that bad things in his life led him to becoming the Prowler, while Miles just being himself and additionally Spider-Man will lead to good things. It already has. Fry also won't be a total villain. She isn't an anti-hero or anything like that, or misunderstood, but sort of a weird respectability between her and Miles about what he does versus what she does. And they have like a weird friendship, like Alice and Luther on Luther. Next film is Spider-Girl 2. Now we have a follow-up to Spider-Girl, and this time Toxin will be the villain. It's revealed that Miles quit being Spider-Man after an undisclosed number of years as Spider-Man because Chameleon killed his parents, so he quit after that. Or something way more disastrous, because I know the whole idea of Spider-Man being built on tragedy and being an optimistic hero, I get that, but I felt that that was bad enough that he would quit, but if you could think of something better, leave it in the comments. Well, somehow Toxin gets birth from Venom and Carnage and takes advantage of Miles' depressed state and starts to use him as a host to ravage New York. I don't know what would happen to Venom and Carnage at the end of the Spider-Man Part 1. Maybe they get taken like by Oscorp or something, or whatever, but like, I don't want them to be destroyed is all. Eventually, she gets the symbiote off of him once it starts to realize what it has become, and he soon bonds to Pat Mulligan, who was hunting him throughout the city, and with that, he soon becomes an anti-hero. Miles offers his advice, but refuses to become Spider-Man again. Simple stuff. Next is Spider-Girl 3. Then for the end of the Spider-Girl trilogy, she fights Raptor, the daughter of Adrian Toomes, Brenda Toomes, as well as a being called Dragon King. This would be a much simpler story, but it would involve legacy and how May's/Brenda's ideologies clash because of what they're doing to live up to their fathers. Dragon King would be a secondary villain as just sort of an extra thing to fight throughout the movie. It wouldn't offer anything exceptionally interesting except for some good fights. Then the final film will be the Spectacular Spider-Verse Across Time and Space. This is the big one. There is a space-time continuum disruption that causes a bunch of spider people from different universes and times to come together and stop three all-powerful beings, Solace, Genix, and Karn. They would be similar to Morlun in terms of villainous and power set. It's possible Spider-Man villains could make cameos. The day would eventually be saved and they all go back to their times and universes. Some with a certain bond could have quieter moments with them and that sort of thing, like very character-driven moments. The heroes in the film would be May Parker, who would be the main protagonist, Ben Reilly, Miles Morales as Spider-Man, Peter Parker at 16 years old, Miles Morales as an adult, Spider-Man 2099, Spider-Woman, Silk, Black Cat, Kane, Ghost Spider, all the movie Spider-Man, Tom Hardy's Venom, Spider-Man Noir, Superior Spider-Man, the Spider from Earth 311, Spider-Man 2211, the Spider-Man from Earth 31411, and Spider-Stan, aka What If Stanley Got Spider Powers. Keep in mind, I had this idea before No Way Home. I swear. Look, it says 2019. Fuck you. Then the final story will be Spider-Man Earth 9804. That would be where all of this would take place. So this would be another video game that would close out the entire universe with certain missions with certain characters. Peter Parker would fight the Sinister Six, Ben Reilly would fight Kraven, and Miles Morales would fight the second version of Mysterio. It could be their final villain, maybe not, I don't know, but whatever. The other characters like Spider-Woman, Silk, Spider-Man 2099, and Spider-Girl would all get a small subplot in the game. Black Cat would even get a subplot as well. But that's it. This has been fun. Not sure what I'll do next, but hopefully it isn't a universe building video.